The magnificence of Monet's garden, beautiful to look at. But how can we possibly draw this using only line when colour is so key to being able to distinguish what's what? How do we not get lost? Let me explain the key technique points I will use to draw this, and then you can watch me in a sped up demo put them into practice. The first point is we need to find something that will be the main clue for our brain to work out what's happening here. And I think in this garden, this row of tulips down the front will do that. Part of that focus is making sure I draw these, or at least a few of them, at least a few in the center, because this is where the eye will naturally gravitate, to draw a few of them carefully enough that they definitely say, this is a tulip. A little tulip tip I've worked out is that drawing them like this is not very accurate for me. That I'm better off positioning the base and then working out exactly how I want the top to join onto it. But establish a number of tulips that are really clear and obviously tulips is important. The next question I ask myself is, if I don't have colour, what do I have? And what I do have is shape and direction of lines. And how can I exploit that? And what I see here in a very simplified form is basically flower heads with stems and leaves. Thinking like this gives me the pattern now to use to help create separation, distinction. What we're trying to do is to plan ways to draw this to try and separate the overwhelming elements that are in this scene, and to make it easier for our brain to see them and recognize them. The third thing I see in this scene is that there are different textures, different shapes and textures. Not just that there's this alternating arrangement, but for instance, the leaves of the tulips are very sculptural and pointed. This flower behind the tulip is small and round in shape and texture. And then behind that, we have some very floppy leaves. And behind that, we have some horizontally focused leaves. And then above that, we have more straight leaves. Down the front here, we have some funny kind of like almost cloverish type leaves. And over here, we have little plants that are really, I assume, weeds, but maybe weeds aren't allowed to be in Monet's garden. And we have a number of those down the front here. So recognizing the fundamental differences in shape, and here we have some fishbone type leaves. So while we have alternating bands of stems and foliage, the stems and foliage are not all the same, and we can use that, even exaggerate that, and at times manipulate where that's happening to create more separation, more distinction. Even if we don't have colour here, the fourth thing we have is value, light and dark. Now, in reality, much of this is actually mid-tone. If we were to take the colour out of this scene, a lot of the colours would go to a very similar mid-range grey. But we do have some strong shadows. And of course, as the artist, we're perfectly free to exaggerate some of the shadows around some of the objects, more so than we have in life, particularly objects that are important to identify quickly. We can highlight them by adding contrasting value around them. If the objects are a light value, then we can make sure that we create dark value around them, which will help make it easier for someone looking at our drawing to identify what they are quickly, and therefore to be able to see, oh, this is a garden. And the fifth thing I can see in this particular scene that I can use to help create order out of what could be chaos is the perspective of the scene, the foreshortening that we see. What we're looking at is sloping away from us, and that means it becomes smaller and smaller. And so as well as having these alternating patterns, the pattern is that things become smaller. Would help if I make them smaller. And smaller. And the amount of foliage in between gets narrower and narrower. And intuitively, if I can reflect this in my line work, someone looking at this scene will realize that this is the ground moving further away, because this is what happens. If I can keep these lines organized enough, describing shapes accurately enough, making them smaller and narrowing the gaps between them as they move further away, will give a very strong clue as to what's happening here. So these are the 5 techniques I'm going to use with this particular scene to try and draw this scene from Monet's garden without colour, sadly, with an ink line, and to create a drawing of the garden that doesn't become impossibly lost in a tangle of lines. Let's start. So I start by actually putting a border around the space I intend to use. I don't usually do that, but I felt like since this was such a wild profusion, I might want to keep it in control in this way. So you can see now that I'm doing this first technique where I'm establishing some very clear tulips, taking some care to draw them. This whole drawing actually took me longer than they normally do it. I spent 60 minutes and then I really wasn't happy with how it was looking. So I spent another 15 minutes and just added some additional line work to it, which I think did help. So it took me almost an hour and a quarter. But I'm establishing these first ones now, these first tulips, right the way across, because I want these to stand out. It's particularly the tulip heads. We don't even need to get too caught up with connecting the heads of large flowers and their stems with their bases. All of that tends to get caught up in the effect. We're probably better off fairly early disconnecting from precision, because we are, in drawing this, drawing the effect, not the exactness. I'm using a 0.3mm pen at the moment, which after I do this closer part, I will switch to a 0.1, and then I will switch to a 0.05 for some of the furthest parts, although it's a bit lacking in ink, that pen, so it wasn't quite as good an experience as I was hoping for. So you can see me also now establishing some value between these plants to separate them and to particularly outline the stems of these tulips, and I'll add some more dark value shortly to try and accentuate the shape of most of them, again because this close to the front horizontal band of tulips is really important to seeing this as a garden. But I'm also trying to do some of the different textures, those fishbone ferns, plants, leaves that are behind those tulips on the left there, and those floppy ribbon shaped leaves. And then on the right hand side there are some more tulips that are further away, so I'm drawing them with a lighter touch. I have switched to the 0.1mm pen, so this is part of the way I create a sense of distance that ties in with the foreshortening, to draw with a lighter line and also with a lighter touch with less detail. And even where I'm adding dark value in the upper half of the drawing, it's a lighter dark value compared to the darkness lower down, because tonal values lighten as they move further away. And you can see me also trying to establish some of these horizontal bands of flowers, and these flowers now are becoming rows of dots and really more just rows of different marks rather than anything that we'd particularly recognize as a row of flowers if we saw them on their own. We read them as flowers now because we've got the more obviously flowers down below. So this is where our brain now is going to particularly make presumptions based on what it can see down the front. And right up the very top, I think I switched to the 0.05 now and having some trouble with it. So I do end up going over that later with the 0.1. And the rows aren't quite as banding across the top up here. They intertwine with each other a bit. So I'm trying to capture a bit of that as well to create some variety in what we see. Particularly up the further parts, it's important to try not to put too many lines. I found this a real dilemma with this drawing, because normally I'm trying to considerably simplify the lines from what I'm wanting to do, but this garden is a garden of profusion, and there is so much texture and shape and line that I really wasn't too sure whether to go further than what I normally would have done, which I did do in the end. And I think that's why I wasn't sure then when to finish it. So here I am going over this shadow up the very top, beyond the flower bed, where there's some hedging or something further, which I thought gave a nice edge to it. And now working on some of those plants down the front, those little grassy, weedy things that I don't think are part of the carefully planned and maintained garden. And you'll notice that down the very front, I do some horizontal lines because I want to give a strong sense of this is the ground, this is the base, the foundation of this garden. And I thought that was also a very nice contrast. So it's another way of adding variety, is to change the directions of our lines. And now we're on the extension, the 15 minutes extra that I did at the end. And so really I'm strengthening some of the values and making some of those flowers not quite so, if you like, collared with darkness, but increasing the darkness around them so it looks a little bit more natural. How do you think it's going? G'day, I'm Stephen Travers. Look, I hope you have a go drawing this. It is a complex scene, but learning to draw the effect of detail, I think, is a really helpful technique to try and master, and it applies to so many things: crowds of people, leaves, bricks, so many things. You'll find this photo on my channel community page. It's worth going there just for a look. It's such a beautiful garden, and we were there on such a beautiful day. So add in more value, darkening more things, creating a greater sense of cohesion, I think, in this lower section than I had in the first 60 minutes of drawing with this additional 15 minutes. Sometimes it is worth coming back to something that we think we have finished. So why not give this a go yourself? But look, whatever you're drawing and however you're drawing it and however complicated it might be, make sure you have fun. I'll see you next time. Bye.